Tashdale, and good afternoon to all. So for the third session, first of all, we at Tibet House are very grateful to all the speakers for accepting our invitation. And also I would like to thank all the participants, the eager young minds for joining today's program. So for the third session, we have a very interesting topic. It is treating emotional imbalance in today's context. So the chairperson for this session is Ms. Gauri Gill, and our speakers are Mr. Saket M. Reddy, Venerable Geshe Ngawang Nowula, and Ms. Shifali Singh. I would like to request our chairperson here, she's here, and our speakers to come up on the dais. Thank you. So before I proceed with today's session, let me introduce our chairperson, Ms. Gauri Gill. She is a Delhi-based photographer. She has exhibited within India and internationally. In 2002, her first major survey exhibition opened at the Screen Kunsthalle, Frankfurt, and traveled to the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art, Humlebeck, in January 2003. Ms. Gill has recently published 2 books with edition Patrick Prey about her collaborations with rural artists, Act of Appearance, and Fields of Sight. I now request Ms. Gill to proceed to today's session. Thank you.
Is it working? Yes, it's working. Thank you so much, Karmala. And it's an honor to be here. It's been such an illuminating day listening to these really wonderful discussions, with this very unique interdisciplinarity, from neuroscience to Buddhism. And I am an artist who works with photography. And I, as Karmala said, yes, I work with rural artists. I make books, exhibitions, work on my projects, over long periods of time. And I'm also a student of Geshe Dorji Damdullah at Tibet House, which is a great privilege. So I just wanted to say how illuminating it's been and, thought-provoking to listen to these discussions today. All day we've looked at the mechanisms for the arising of emotions, and the challenges in today's world, which is, we looked at different images, and of course we live with this reality of, scarcity of resources, of, so much inequality, economic inequality, the increasingly fast-paced pace of life, the challenges of technology, and everything else that contemporary life is throwing at us, and the accompanying increase in mental health issues. So finally, it's very nice to be at a panel which is addressing how we can also begin to solve for, these challenges. The Buddha himself, as it is said, did not create anything, but discovered reality, the correct view of reality and our own true nature, and sought to point us towards the view of emptiness and interdependence and compassion, unconditional compassion, not to prove anything intellectually, but to heal our suffering, for which he felt profoundly, and which was his motivation for enlightenment. So I think, in that sense, I think he was very much inclined towards trying to solve things for people, or trying to heal their suffering. And one of, I think, the very liberating aspects of Buddhism is that it offers us ways, it offers us techniques to work with the mind, to take responsibility for ourselves. In that sense, it's very empowering, to realize we are responsible for the reality we create, and therefore we can also correct that. And finally, I think, we do, as students, learn to have great conviction in the Buddha nature, because I think the good news is that in the end, we have uh, pure nature, underlying everything. We all have the same nature, which is error free, free of fear, free of every fault, and full of, free of exclusion, separation from others, and in fact, love and compassion for others. So, I think, in that sense, there is hope despite everything that we are all, facing, and Buddhism certainly offers us hope and possibility. I'm really looking forward to what the, very wonderful and eclectic group of panelists will offer. So I think, to begin with, I'm going to dive right into it because we don't have a lot of time. Mr. Saket Reddy is currently pursuing his PhD in the Center for Consciousness Studies at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, NIMHANS, Bangalore. His PhD work focuses on understanding the neuroscience of yoga and meditation. And he uses techniques like, EEG and MRI to study neural correlates of cognition and well-being. So welcome, Dr. Reddy. Mr. Reddy.
Thank you so much. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this wonderful opportunity. It's a privilege actually to be speaking amongst this audience, wonderful speakers. So from morning, we've been listening to many different talks from many different perspectives. From Buddhist perspective, we had a Jungian perspective, Western psychology perspective on emotions, negative emotions, positive emotions. We had one discussion about what emotions really are. We should not be labeling them as positive or negative. Rather, emotions are just emotions which need to be experienced as they arise instead of labeling them in a particular manner. So in my talk, I'll be talking about talking a little more in detail about what emotions really are and how can we regulate emotions from the neuroscience perspective. So most of this work which I'll be talking about today is based on my PhD work and also based on broadly what the literature on meditation talks about. So to start with, Christoph Koch, in his book, The Feeling of Life Itself, he talks about the most important component of life is consciousness itself. The ability to feel something, experience something is the crux of who we are. And that's the thing which differentiates us from a machine. So what differentiates us human beings from a machine like DeepMind, Google's DeepMind or supercomputer is not just the intelligence, which is basically the information processing capacity, but also the ability to experience certain things, ability to feel, experience life as it is. So consciousness is the greatest miracle and unsolved mystery in existence. When I say unsolved mystery, so there is this problem called as the hard problem of consciousness, which David Chalmers talks about, which is basically about how does brain, which is physical in nature, which is matter based, how does this brain give rise to this experience, this consciousness? That's the greatest unsolved mystery in existence. And scientists have been trying to understand this problem. And so far, there has not been a solution for this problem. And why is it difficult? So in this presentation, broadly speaking, I'll be covering these aspects. And why is it difficult for humans to regulate their emotions and feelings? What is emotion in the first place? How are emotions related to what is happening within the body? Because it's very important when you talk about emotions, we talk about what is happening within the body, because the basis of emotions lie actually in the body and not just the mind. So what is happening within the body is very important. And how do we regulate emotions quickly and also in the long run? So let's get started about this. we've been hearing about emotions, but are emotions the purpose of brain? What is the purpose of brain? Is it thinking, emotions, feeling, art, music, love, consciousness, etc.? What the neuroscience says is that that's not the fundamental purpose of the brain. Brain evolved not for thinking emotions, but for regulating what is happening within the body. That is regulating the internal milieu. It's called as allostasis. And in the process of it, in the process of regulating what's happening within the body, the brain needs to anticipate and predict the needs before they arise. And that's the core function of the brain. And that's important because that's important for survival. That's important for proliferation of the genes and the species. So brain anticipates future needs and prepares for it by bringing appropriate physiological changes. Brain predicts based on the past experiences and the current context of what it is going through. Just to understand the predicament of being a brain is literally like in a black box. The skull, it has no direct access to reality. The way it senses reality is through the sense organs. That's the only way it has access. And sense organs collect information from the world. And 5 ways, we all know about this. This is called as extroception. And not just extroception, brain is also sensing what is happening within the body, not just the outside, but also inside. That's called as interoception. And based on this extroceptive stimuli and also the interoceptive stimuli, the brain is making an appropriate decision on what needs to be done at a particular moment. So that's what, and interoception is very important because if we did not know what is happening, for example, I feel hunger, I go out and eat, I feel stomach pain, I do something else. So we need to know what is happening within ourselves so that we take appropriate actions. And the sensing of insight is called as interoception. And extroception and interoception are both important because both lead to appropriate actions. And the way we communicate with the world is based on this integration of information from extroceptive stimuli and also the interoceptive stimuli. So we are not just individual entities, we are embedded in an environment. We constantly interact with what's happening around us. This moment by moment interaction with what's happening around us in terms of the air we breathe, the water we drink, everything is important for the survival of the species and also experiencing life the way it's happening. So this integration, neuroscience research has identified that this integration happens in interoceptive cortices, which then communicate with the frontal regions, and also they also communicate with the subcortical regions like hypothalamus, amygdala, etc., so that appropriate action is taken. And so once this integration happens of the extroceptive and the interoceptive stimuli, human experience happens. And this human experience is created from within. So from morning, we've been hearing about, Geshe-la talked about the story about the simile about how Buddha talked about 2 arrows, wherein it's not the first arrow which is making or creating suffering, but the second arrow of the reaction to what happens, which creates suffering. So if the understanding is there that the human experience is created entirely from within, whatever the stimuli might be, it will not have an impact on how the experience is created. And that's where the empowerment of a human being lies. And that's where actually the crux of how meditation acts, in a sense that there's a distance between, there's a gap between stimuli and reaction. In this gap, awareness happens. This awareness is important for regulating emotions. And so this is well established in the sense that whatever we are experiencing in the terms of colors, tones, smells, everything are the constructions by the brain, and they do not exist as it appears to exist. It exists in a way which is relevant for the survival of our species. For example, a particular stimuli, how we perceive it is different from, say, a dog perceives it. Dog perceives a particular stimulus based on what is relevant for its survival, based on the evolution which has happened. Similarly, we perceive a particular stimulus based on our evolution and our own brains, our own cultural evolution. All these factors lead to the constructions which happen in the brain. So how subjective experience, which is called as consciousness by the Western scientists, is still not known. This is the hard problem of consciousness. And when we talk about consciousness, the most important aspect is what it is to be like a particular organism. So Thomas Nagel in 1974 asked about what it is like to be a bat. He wrote this compelling article on this aspect, which is the fundamental of consciousness. And this is the most important thing to consider when we talk about emotions as well, because they're subjective in nature and we have an ability to respond to certain stimuli in a conscious manner. And as I was talking about, the fundamental purpose of the brain is to anticipate what's going to happen and create necessary physiological changes. So brain is not reactive in nature. Brain is predictive in nature. It predicts the incoming sensory information based on the prior knowledge and also the context in which it exists right now. And this is applicable even for the interoceptive information, how the heart is beating, how the lungs are breathing, what the stomach is saying. All this interoceptive information also enters the brain, and brain predicts what this incoming information means. And then it integrates these information to create an outcome or a behavior. And affect is the core feature of human experience. So this is called as the circumplex, wherein every experience that we are going through has two fundamental components of valence and arousal. So every experience, it feels like something to be like. It feels either pleasant, it feels unpleasant. There's a degree of pleasantness, there's a degree of unpleasantness. And also there's a sense of arousal in terms of, say, alertness, or is it more towards alertness or less towards, more like drowsiness kind of states. So all feelings can fit in this circumplex. And affect is this basic sense of feeling which we have, and it depends on interoception. And this feeling within decides what emotions we go through, what thoughts we have, how we behave, etc. So right now, we had some discussions about the Paul Ekman's theory of emotion. But right now, as far as neuroscientific evidence is concerned, the most compelling theory, which is based on large literature, is how emotions are, is the theory of constructed emotion by Lisa Barrett, which talks about emotions as a predictive, having a predictive component to it in terms of what we discussed previously. So in every waking moment, your brain uses past experience organized as concepts to guide your actions and give your sensations meaning. When this concept involved are emotion concepts, your brain constructs instances of emotion. So the brain is judging what the sensations mean, and then it's interpreting based on the past experiences. And emotion is a much more complex mental construction, and feeling is a much broader thing. And emotion, to a large extent, depend on the mental construction, which again depends on the culture, the childhood, the whole exposure to life which has happened for a particular person. And this interoceptive information, which I talked about being very important for emotions, is conveyed from within the body to the brain by whole circuit, vagus circuit, which transmits this information to the thalamus, thalamic brainstem and thalamic regions. And then from the thalamic regions, the information goes to the subcortical regions like amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and also to the prefrontal cortex. And this is called as the quick pathway, and this is called as the fast pathway. This is slow pathway, in the sense that information going here is more reactive in nature. We react to some stimuli, And that's because of the activation of the amygdala and the subcortical regions. But to act consciously, respond appropriately, we need this higher road, which is much slower in nature, but more accurate in terms of perception. And this in turn regulates the subcortical regions. This regulation is impaired in negative emotions, and this is the regulation which is strengthened by meditation practices. And so, broadly speaking, how meditation helps is this top down and bottom up. Top down in the sense of strengthening the regulatory mechanisms, the strengthening of the regulatory pathway between the prefrontal networks and the subcortical networks, using various practices which strengthen the attention and meta awareness, etc. And also the bottom up pathways which change the interoceptive sensations, so that the way the brain interprets the information is changed by these pathways. And then I'm skipping this, or I'll just go through quickly. So, for example, if you take about, say, stage fear or anger or any other emotion for that matter, this is what is happening in general, in the sense that first there's a perception of, say, any emotion. And this perception is based on the past experience, and it then predicts what that experience, what needs to happen at that particular moment based on the past experience. And then in anticipation of the threat, the body tries to prepare for the threat. It mobilizes resources and all these things happen. Sensations happen. And then the sensations go to the brain. And then that sensations are interpreted to give rise to a particular emotion. And then that all this is like a simulation prediction happening in the brain, which gives rise to that experience. And then how meditation helps is basically at the perception level and also at the interoceptive sensation level. So one of the best ways to change the interoceptive sensations is by breathing practices. So mind is difficult to handle or control, because the moment one tries to handle the mind, it goes out of control. But what is in our control is how we breathe. And that's the fundamental of pranayama and how it functions. So this text talks about how when the breath wanders, the mind is unsteady, and when the breath is calm, the mind will be still. And this is the fundamental of pranayama practices. And we looked at, in my PhD study, we looked at how pranayama changes certain aspects of brain function. We noticed that even 6 minutes of pranayama practice can change certain functions, which will lead to relaxation, enhanced self-regulation, etc. So it's a very accessible, effective, quick method of lowering one's, emotions, destructive emotions kind of thing. But in the long run, it's always important to work at both the perception level and also at the interoceptive sensation level. And for that, the best method remains meditation, wherein we have to first work on understanding how it arises. As Ravindra sir was talking about, attention, internalized attention is the most important thing when it comes to understanding how it arises. And then once it arises, we have certain options with us, which various options like, what to do with those emotions, how do we handle them, whether do we reappraise them, or do we, consciously change the content, etc. And then, so basically we're strengthening this pathway through meditation. And research also indicates changes in connectivity in long-term practitioners. Basically, for example, this is a particular pathway which links the limbic cortices with the prefrontal regions. Meditators show enhanced connectivity in these regions. And also, as you can see, the correlations. And then they're more present, which is an important aspect of handling what is happening right now. So this is a chart which is showing the decreased default mode network activity in meditators compared to those who have never done meditation. And then there's also, it's not just the perception, the strengthening of the connections between the prefrontal regions and the subcortical regions, but also how unconsciously one reacts to stimuli. That gets changed with practice of meditation. So if you see here, there's lower amygdala activity in the meditation practitioners compared to the controls. And there is also the strengthening of connectivity between the prefrontal regions and amygdala I was talking about. The road gets strengthened with practice. That's what we see here in this figure. And finally, from my study, we have looked at the resting state EEG data of the meditators as they do meditation. So resting state reveals about the personality changes. So meditation broadly impacts one in two manners. There are these state effects and trait effects. State effects are those which are the changes which happen immediately as one practices meditation, the relaxation which one feels, the feeling of calmness, etc. But trait effects are the real important things which are fundamentally changing the way how one is, the whole personality, the way of being is changed. And that reflects in this resting state EEG data, wherein we observed an increased frontal midline theta activity in the advanced practitioners, which basically indicates increase in the activity of the anterior cingulate cortex, which is a very important region when it comes to meta-awareness, self-regulation, attentional regulation, etc. And that's what we observe compared to those who have low meditation experience or those who don't have any meditation experience as such. And for example, this is one EEG graph of an advanced practitioner. These are the very high synchronization in the theta and the alpha regions. And this is again showing very high synchronized activity in the beta range and also the alpha range. I'm done. Thank you so much. So basically, that's how meditation helps one in regulating emotions. It's not just at the level of perception, but also changing the whole, the interoceptive sensations, which is important. So thank you so much for this opportunity, for this wonderful honor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Reddy. And it's interesting to know that feeling is a broader spectrum than emotion, and and that there's a distinction. And also, as Venerable Geshe-la had pointed out, the 5 omnipresent mental factors. And you also spoke of perception leading to the construction of the processes that lead to stage fright. And as we study also, discrimination is a very key factor that determines your feeling and then your intention. And I've always wondered if, like a lot of the current CBT, cognitive behavioral training used in Western psychology is based on actually Buddhist techniques. And, so now that brings us to Venerable Nobula. Venerable Nawang Nobu joined Seraje Monastery in 1984 and graduated as Geshe in 2014. After graduation, he served as director of Seraje Science Center from 2013 to 19 and director of Modern Education Department of Seraje Monastery from 2018 to 21. Currently, he serves as a supervisor for the Thuktam Research Labs Unit A, located in Tushilhampo Monastery, Bailakupe. So extremely interesting and wonderful. Looking forward, Venerable.
Tony Ninja Sundo Jovelam, Cheji Saze Kanji Tendogun Chana Pemo Tinzin Jazola, Soa de Shendulundu Show. Juni Gijin Dadim Bulana, Nangajisi Pondo Sundo. So good afternoon. I'm honored and privileged to be here. For that, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Geshe-la and Tibet House for all the organizer here. It has been a long day. I hope you'll be able to remain attentive. But fortunately, my presentation is not that profound, prepared, not that profound. You can take this lightly. in between, you can, if you prefer, you can doze off. It's okay. So, well, why I'm saying this is that, much of what I have to share has been already covered um, since from the morning itself. So I will just basically touch on some of the things that I feel is applicable to practice in your daily life. So I hope that my presentation will give you some idea to take home. As you know, this is a very popular, quote in Tibetan mind training traditions. When among many, watch your tongue or speech. When alone, watch your mind. So here, it means that, while in a crowded area, if you talk too much, you may get into trouble, right? So I prefer not to talk too much. We have a limited time also. And then when alone, you might have, noticed in the previous presentations, we talked about ruminations, right? So our mind never relax. We keep, talking, chattering, wondering, so many things. So here I would like to just, share that if you really want to know how, restless your mind is, just stay for 5 minutes, close your eyes, not here, but back in your room. So you can relax for 5 minutes and just, follow where your thought is going, like, for 5 minutes. And you will notice that your thoughts or your mind will be everywhere. And the sequence it comes, like the first one and the second one, or most of the time, there's no connections. It will just go everywhere, regardless of your the situation where you are in. It will move around, sometimes in the past, sometimes in the future, right? Not mostly not in the present, mostly in the past or in the future. And then after 5 minutes, you can just try to remember everything and put them on paper, and see how connected this thought that you had for the 5 minutes. And then one thing, I mean, normally we categorize the thought or process in three categories, like one in a positive, although some doesn't want to say it positive or negative, and other negative, and then there's a neutral one. So if you notice that your mind is going more towards negative, then you have to be careful, right? And then if it is going towards more positive, then you have to be inspired and try to, improve on that. And if it is neutral, then you have at least some foundational state where you can build on that and then try to be more positive. That's one technique that you can apply. That's why I think if you are alone, if you think that you are alone, and then sometimes, these days, loneliness is one of the biggest problem, right? But in our tradition, scholars, after many years of studies, they prefer to stay alone. So that's really interesting thing. And for the Tibetans, like young Tibetans here, let me just remind you, few years back, I think 10 years back, there was a movie, a Tibetan movie. In that, the protagonist, like the main actor, who break up with his, girlfriend. And then I was watching that movie, and then I thought that the end story will be same as Bollywood, like where the actor will, become alcoholic and so on, like this, depressed. But interestingly, at the end, the character, the main protagonist, he went up Himalaya to meditate. So see the trend there in Tibetan culture. Like this is a Buddhist culture that I'm talking about. So there's so many things that you can learn from that tradition. These techniques, simple but and also applicable, you can apply in your daily lives. So that's why I'm saying that when alone, don't feel lonely. You have lots of things to work on in your mind. Sometimes I feel that people who are playing video games like PUBG games, right? So I feel that if they, instead of playing on gadgets, if they played with their thought, like contemplate on their negative emotions, anger or hatred, and then try to apply antidote, that will will be an interesting sort of a game that you can work on, and then you can, at the same time, you can improve your mental state, health. And secondly, in training, it says that train first with the strongest destructive emotions, right? So once you have done this 5 minutes analysis, you will notice what sort of a mental distractions or emotions that's disturbing you for the most. And then you can apply based on that, you can work on that. So here, for instance, if it is anger, the antidote is, anger normally happens when you came, I think this morning, one of the presenters said, like, while you are relaxing, you might notice someone walk by who you don't like, right? There you get angry and then you lost your, mental balance. So for that, I think there are few steps that you can apply. For that, let me go for the next. So Geshe Thapkela has introduced 3 different conditions or factors that give rise to emotions. And one of them is here. This is from Abhidhamma Kosha's text, from Abhidhamma's perspective, where because you have not abandoned your afflictive emotions, that's there, that's ready to arise, always there, and then remain close to the object of afflictive emotions. And then the third one, have distorted emotions, or there are some other translations like misconception, inoperate attention. So they are different. But what I want to focus is the second one, right? The first, for the beginners, the best and easiest ways to overcome negative emotions is to distance yourself from that stimuli. So in my case, when I was very young, I feel now very fortunate that we don't have this world in our palm or in our hand, right? Many of the speakers before this morning has already said that the social media's influence, which is not there at our time. I was born in India, and I loved cricket when I was young. So we listened to commentary whole day on radio, right? But now everything is on your palm, like you tap and then you look around. And this is the object of distraction, like object that arise your negative emotions. There are positive impacts also, but most of the time we get involved, got distracted. So what I would like to suggest is that, it would be very helpful if you are able to stay away from these gadgets every day, certain parts of your, day. You make some commitment and stay away from it. And instead, if you hold something that you can, read, maybe a book, good book, or short articles. So this will definitely help you reduce the, uh, impacts of negative emotions. But here, let me share one story that recently I was in Ladakh. I was involved in a research where we study meditators, not monks, householders. So here, I think majority of the participant are not monk, but you can be like them. I think one meditator, when we ask him, he is in his 90s, like 95 years old, and he every year he travels to Bodh Gaya alone, from Ladakh to Bodh Gaya and back, spend at least few days there in Bodh Gaya, and then return by himself. He's 95. Can anybody imagine where I will be at that stage, right? So when we asked him what is the secret of his life, he said, live simple, live your life simply. And then he said, like, it's when we told him that it's difficult because, the world is highly globalized, right? And then everything is, in contact these days. Nobody is isolated. Then he said that it's similar like what Gandhi's three monkeys. He said, even if you have eyes, act as a blind, and even if you have ears, act as a deaf, and if you can speak, act like a dumb. So this maybe we can practice, right? Through practice, if he can do that, and then I think everybody can do that also. That's why I think restraining you from the object of this negative emotions, you don't have to go to Himalayas, right? You can do it yourself anywhere. I think Geshe Lode Sangula and others had quoted from Bodhisattva's Way of Life by Shantideva, where it says that even if you are able to tame your mind, even if you are, staying in a community where it's very, negatively oriented, but still with your composure, or you'll be able to retain calmness. And then that's actually the practice of bodhisattvas, right? Once they tame their mind, they pay to come back to samsara, not to get deluded, but to serve. And they are able to do that. So I think that's one thing. But for the beginner, try to restrain or stay away from these objects of negative emotions. And then I think let me just briefly touch on the distorted emotions, because here I quote from His Holiness. In summary, ignorance lies at the root of all the afflictions, and the afflictions are inevitably at the root of the suffering. So if you want to come out of suffering, then you have to trace, or you have to uh, look for the cause of suffering. And then the cause of suffering, as everybody since from the morning has said, that it's negative emotions or afflictive emotions or kailash or whatever you called it, that troubles you. So that's a mental factors. And at the root of that, there's self-centric ego that's there. So here, let me just share one experience that I had. As in my introduction, like I was introduced as serving as a director for modern education at Sergei Monastery, so which is involved in lots of administrative work, right? So one time at a meeting, I received teaching on the way of Bodhisattva's life from His Holiness on several occasions. As His Holiness advised, I carry that book all the time wherever I go. And even recently, His Holiness said that, at one of the online session where His Holiness was asked how to find a good teacher, and His Holiness said that that book, that scripture, or that text itself is a teacher. So you should carry this, you should keep this wherever you go. So I try to do that. And then one time at a meeting, I was hugely criticized, right? So I thought I have done something, but I was hugely criticized. And then after the meeting, it was dinner time, and I was not able to enjoy my dinner. I was not able to do my daily prayers also, and then I try to forget, nothing happening. Like I was too emotional, and then I immediately, out of sudden, I remember that I should refer to that book. And then I read the 8th chapter. There's a particular section where Acharya Shantideva was trying to inform the advantage of exchanging self and others, that portion. So I read that part, and out of sudden, everything, like as if as if someone put extinguisher on fire, like that, everything dies down. So there it says that the root cause is the self-centered, self-grasping view that I have, which is hiding inside, and then projecting itself as a supporting me, right? The idea that I got when I have that sort of a situation, I check and then found out that person who criticized actually is trying to, support me, right? So the self-grasping view, that is the main enemy that's hiding inside me. He was criticizing that entity, not me. So immediately I found out that, I think the example that His Holiness always give, that enemy is your real teacher. So you should pay homage to your enemy. And if you, this is just one incident. In my case, I'm not good practitioner, but I share that, if you are able to, continuously study and apply those techniques, even person like me, I normally introduce myself as an ordinary Buddhist monk. And I always encourage that I always tell that there's a huge difference between simple and ordinary. I'm just an ordinary Buddhist monk, and His Holiness always introduced himself as a simple Buddhist monk. And I found out that there's a huge gap between simple and ordinary. As an ordinary, even being an ordinary monk, I have that advantage, just knowing the meaning of those things. So I encourage everybody to, study a little bit more. And lastly, at the same time, I think this morning somebody talks about Heart Sutra. I think Lochen, I think mentioned about Heart Sutra. So you should definitely read, and because if you really want to uproot the distorted emotion, then you need to know about the reality. That's the emptiness nature of everything. So here, with this quote, I would like to end. This is a different translation, but at least you have the meaning here. Oh, you who wish to guard your minds, I beseech you with folded hands. Always exert yourself to guard mindfulness and alertness. So these are the two tools. I think you don't have to go and purchase it. You have those tools with you. You just have to enhance them. And at the same time, the attention that we are talking about earlier, all the tools, we possess all these tools. We just have to, try some techniques and regularly, try to enhance those tools. And then I think everything will be peaceful. With that, I would like to thanks once again for the organizer for giving me this opportunity and all the audience for their attentive listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Venerable Nobula, and so much humility and humor in your presentation. And it, makes one realize that the difference between those who practice and don't practice, and also brings to mind, as you were talking about inappropriate attention and self-grasping ignorance, Arya Nagarjuna's stanza, ceasing of karmas and afflictions is nirvana. Karmas and afflictions arise from the conceptualizations of inappropriate attention, which in turn arises from the elaborations of self-grasping ignorance. Ignorance ceases into emptiness. And Geshe-la often reminds us when we are upset with things outside that actually the demons are your self-grasping ignorance and self-centered attitude, and to fight with them and not with external so-called enemies. So thank you so much for your very powerful presentation. And now we have Ms. Shefali Singh, who is a trained clinical psychologist who has been working as a psychotherapist in Ambedkar University, Delhi, at their public clinic, SR, since 2017. Her interest lies in studying the interface of social and clinical thinking through a psychoanalytical lens and understanding the structure of various social constructs. She has been actively supervising and teaching students for their clinical training in psychoanalytically oriented work. So it will be wonderful to hear from you.
Probably I'll just speak from here. Okay. I would like to start by thanking the organizing committee and the Tibet House for having me here. I don't have a presentation, but it's also a very conscious choice I have made. I was also observing that, since morning, we have been talking about emotions, but it almost feels that as if it is something which is outside of us, and we have to look at it. We have to deconstruct in some way to understand what it is. But my understanding is also that it's something within you. So if you have to come to terms with what it is, you'll also have to experience what emotions are. Yeah. So keeping that in mind as the goal, I'll be narrating actually a story of a person who came to me, and let's see how you experience that story. Okay. So I'll be reading it out. Yeah. I'll start my presentation with a line from Oliver Sacks' book. Oliver Sacks is a very famous neurologist. A man who mistook his wife for a hat. While discussing the same case, he says, our cognitive sciences are themselves suffering from an agnosia essentially similar to the person. What he meant by this line is how the field of neurology and neuropsychology wholly lost the emotional, the concrete, the personal, the real, and been reduced, as it were, to the abstract and the categorical. It was a very moving experience to read about this particular case. Not so much with respect to the peculiarity of the case that was presented, as it was with the emotional investment with which he had written about his engagement with this person. It was the person who existed in his mind, not some parts of the brain. He carried the image of the whole, a self with an identity, and set out to understand how it was deteriorating due to the visual agnosia. To his surprise, he was still carrying out the normal functions of his life. He asked his wife, how was he managing? And she replied, he sings all the time. Eating songs, dressing songs, bathing songs, everything is a music. The rhythm of his being, which was visually lost, was still kept intact through music, as he was a gifted musician. Oliver Sacks recommend him to make music the center of his being. And that's why I also titled my presentation as Music of Therapy. It is this rhythm that caught my attention and which I will develop further in my presentation. However, one cannot make sense of the rhythm without coming close to the experience of chaos. What is this chaos? Each of us has experienced this in milder forms when our structure routine is disrupted in some way. We feel lost, almost confused, emotionally all over the place until the routine is reestablished. Now substitute your being or yourself in place of this structure. It is your being that holds you in place. It is that center that Oliver Sacks refers to. If this being or yourself is dismantled, there is nothing holding you as you. What is left is an emotional mess of a person. Just knowing this is a possibility can cause extreme anxiety in a person. Not only this chaos emotional, but it also happens at the level of the brain. Ivy McKenzie talks about it when he says, and this is very interesting because he himself was also a neurologist, the pathological physiology of the Parkinsonian syndrome is the study of an organized chaos, a chaos induced in the first instance by destruction of important integrations and reorganized on an unstable basis in the process of rehabilitation. Winnicott, he's a very famous psychologist, was of a similar view and interestingly points to the same missing link in neurology. His papers were written as a critique to ECT and leucotomy, which was gaining popularity as a possible course of treatment at that time. The major crux of his argument was how if neurosurgeons would continue to see insanity or madness as associated with certain brain tissue changes, they would never be able to see their patients as humans, as whole and real. He goes on to say, and I quote him, after interference with the physical brain, no man or woman can be sure of his identity. He's not there to be sure because the person built up over the whole time since birth is not there. Through the case study that I will be presenting today, my hope is that by witnessing the experience of emotional chaos that the person endured, one would be able to imagine which until at this point of time, one was talking only in terms of neurotransmitter deficiencies or excesses or certain brain changes. It is a sincere effort on my part to restore the center in the field of neurosciences, a space reserved for the linking and integrating thread, the identity and being of an individual. For me, it is this self, being, identity, which is the music of neurons, one which gives a unique communication to each individual brain. I will share only the significant characteristics of this case to keep her identity confidential. Miss P came to me during the most difficult emotional time of her life. She was working and taking care of a house, something which was very tiring and demanding for her. It seems there was no one to tell her that she herself was emotionally collapsing. The first time I saw her in an online mode, I felt very intimidated. She belonged to a very influential family, and I wondered what I had to offer to her. I felt very poor just to realize I even had this self to experience poverty. She had nothing which could allow her to feel all the richness that she had around her. She began to narrate a life which seemed to be falling apart, and she didn't know what to do. I could see tears welling up in her eyes, but she wouldn't allow herself to experience it. I wondered why, but I kept the question to myself. She told me how she has everything in her life: good husband, children, material wealth, good career. Everyone tells her how lucky she is. And then she entered into a world of guilt. Why is she not grateful for it? Why is she letting all of this collapse? Finally, she allowed her tears to make a communication of its own. Unable to hold herself any longer, she melts into an emotional mess of crying. She apologized for doing this to me, for not being able to hold herself. She began to tell me how everyone sees her as a very sensitive person, as she is unable to keep herself emotionally in place. Anything could make her emotionally break down, and others would make her feel that something is wrong with her. Why is she not doing something about it? Some suggested that she stop feeling so much, and it was this thought that made her come to therapy. Now it made sense why she was not letting herself cry in the beginning. I told her how emotions allow us to communicate, and I would like her to create space for her to make that communication. The significance of opening this mode of emotional communication came to me much later, as well as the importance of her career. She is a professor of art history, and she teaches a course designed by her on the artistic importance of waste material. Art, or any kind of artistic expression, has a very significant role in our lives. It allows us to give an imaginative elaboration to our body, to various circumstances, as well as to our emotional inner world. It gives us meaning, a function played by our mind and in physical form, the brain. I received the communication of her impoverished inner emotional world while she was expressing anger over an accident or the incident that took place at her workplace. She had gone to attend a lecture and a student had kept a seat for her. Suddenly, another teacher came and started pushing her to create a seat for her. She cried and said, "I've shrunken my body so much. Why is it so hard for people to give me that little space as well?" Now I could witness her inner world, which was occupied by the crisis of various family members. There was no emotional space within her for her. Her only respite was to exist as a discarded waste and to seek a way to give her some kind of an imagination in this state. Now her course made sense. She had found a way to give artistic impression to her being through the waste, which was the only link to herself. But another crisis emerged, and a significant one: the fear of loss of this mental faculty. The understanding of this came to me in the most unexpected of ways. There came a time in therapy when I would feel mentally exhausted, as if my mind was shutting down. It was almost impossible to keep myself awake in the session. She became more restless in sessions, crying and breaking down on the smallest of things. One day, in between her crying, she said, "How I look exhausted all the time, and she doesn't know if this therapy is going to help her." This was the time when the exhaustion seemed to be lifted. I realized I was that good object of hers that she was keeping safe while her own body was being shrunken by the emotional mess of her family. This good object was a mind which could witness and give meaning to the emotional breakdown that she was enacting for me session after session. I told her she must have wanted me to see what she was enacting for her to feel real. To this, she suddenly said how she has never been able to differentiate the real from the unreal, the parts of her from the parts of others that were introjected in her. Mind is what helps you come in touch with reality, but she was losing her mind all the time. How was she to give an imaginative elaboration to the emotional drama that she was enacting for me? Since there was no space for a self or an identity or a being to emerge, it had to emerge through me. Me being that mind which is witnessing the emotional communication she is making and giving meaning to her distorted emotional being. As she became more at ease that I will hold her mind for her so that she doesn't disappear like an apparition, she became more comfortable playing artistically with her emotional chaos to allow some kind of a musical being of hers to emerge. This took place in a more recent session of hers. We were sitting quietly, lost in our thoughts. This quietude doesn't bother her any longer, as she can now use it for herself instead of enacting her inner emotional world to me. Suddenly, my mind started humming a tune, and a thought emerged about how the notes of music are so broken and disconnected. But it is this rhythm which allows it to come together to form a music. This took me to her childhood when she was forced to learn a particular kind of music. She always regretted it, that she couldn't create a music of her own. I told her my thoughts, to which she immediately became excited and said how she always wanted to learn the Tanpura. I asked her why particularly the Tanpura, and she said because it doesn't have a music of any kind. She always imagined it to be an empty instrument on which she could create music of her own choice. She said that how it could be so close to one's body that it feels like one's own body, which could create something for its own pleasure. This took me to a card. It's a card on a particular test in psychology where a boy is holding a broken tanpura and looking quite sad. Touching this sadness, I said, you never had this empty space to play out your emotional self. With a sad smile, she said, yes, but I think now I can learn. The session ended, and finally, her emotional journey made sense to me. She had to emotionally enact for her to open a mental space which could gather her and develop a music out of her broken parts. I had to become that empty holding mental space for her, since her own mind was struggling to come out of a state of utter confusion of real and unreal. This finally gave the glimpse of hope. The self was in the process of becoming. This case could serve as a very significant learning experience for both neuroscientists and psychologists. If neuroscientists do not see the emotional meaning of the chaos of the brain, they're not able to come in touch with the significant function that the mind serves. The brain or the mind serve as a meaning-making function for the individual, from which the continuity of a self and being emerges. Chaos of the mind is one communication that the self or the being of the person is in shatters and is unable to fulfill its meaning-making function. The mind, for that reason, is eternal in Hinduism, something which creates a story of the emotional ups and downs of humanity and passes it on from one generation to another. If this mind is destroyed or attacked in any way, there's nothing of the self, of the society, that is left to tell a story. It is this part that needs to be preserved while looking at the function of the brain. I'm hoping if neurologists and psychologists work together as brain and mind, with neurologists looking into the physiological imbalances and psychologists working towards a self which could give meaning to this chaos and the experience of survival of this destruction of the mind. The chances of recovery are much better as each of us carries the unconscious fantasy of an eternal mind, like the Buddha, which witnessed and survived its own destruction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shefali. Listening to you also made me think of your own role as an observer, so closely witnessing, and, how this kind of deep listening and making this person feel seen, is also an act of great healing and compassion. And finally, we've been learning and studying or analyzing the mind today for not only to benefit ourselves, but to hopefully benefit others. So thank you so much. And we don't, unfortunately, have time for question and answer. So we just, sorry, we do have two questions. We can, so if anyone has questions.
So my question is to Ms. Shefali. So in the end, you said that you hope that one day neurologists and psychologists work together to understand the inner being and the nuances of the mind. Uh, so what do you think? What are your views on the fact that due to their working separately or they're working in isolation or silos, how has that impacted the entire research on the mind and that applies to other disciplines also, but I'm specific to this discipline. That how do you think this would bring about a positive change through research or proper propagation of proper ideas, or make communication more easy in terms of delivering it to the people who need it the most? So that is what I just wanted to get your views on that.
So the thought had actually emerged because, so neurologists are also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one is also looking at the brain, and they're also looking at what kind of disturbances which are taking place within the brain. That's one part of it, true, that it is happening. There are evidence for it. But one is also dealing with the human being. The human being is also experiencing this chaos in some way. So unless you don't understand how that person is experiencing it, how are we actually going to give any meaning to it? So I may give them medicines, it might cure it, but there will always be a memory of what had happened to them. Until the time we don't make sense of it for them, the chaos is there in the form of memory. So if we don't work in that sense together, that there's also a self which is there, which is witnessing what is happening to the body, then we won't be able to really help them. Like that's why I actually shared the first case of the neurologist, the person who was actually falling apart, physically, but the being of it was so intact. He had music in every form. So even though things were collapsing physically, nobody knew he had anything. He was working as if nothing happened because there was a self which was there to keep him intact. So if one doesn't look into these things, we are missing out a very important link here. Yeah, so that was my idea of bringing them together. Yeah, I don't want to go into a state of dissociation where I say, oh, neurologists are not wanted or psychologists are not wanted. Both have to work together. Yeah. I think through dialogue, probably that's what we're doing here also, that if you're also receptive for a dialogue for different fields, I mean, that's also what happens, when there are differences, we open space for dialogue so that everyone exists in that space.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tenzing. My question is to Geshe-la. Geshe-la, you mentioned about the practice, like close your eyes for 5 minutes, then like reflect on your thoughts, let your mind wander. And you mentioned about like write down all the whether it's the positive thoughts or negative there or it's neutral. But I have a like questions like, is it better to have a neutral thoughts or a positive thought? I remember in my school days, our Chigala mentioned that it's good to have a neutral or what do you say, Tangyom state. So I'm a bit confused about that. If you can elaborate on that. Thank you.
Yeah, this short 5-minute sessions that if you try this, I think this will at least give you some idea what sort of a mental thought you are having most of the time. Oh, but 5 minute is not enough. I think you have to repeat this several times, and then you will be able to point out where your mind or thought is leaning towards most of the time. As for your question, I think well, we try to cultivate more positive thoughts here, positive emotions, whatever you called it, because everybody has that sense of aspiration to be happy, right? So the cause of happiness, as all the speakers has already mentioned, we have to generate those causes, and the negative emotions, they put us into this terrible situation. So to overcome them, you have to enhance the positive emotions. So here, neutral is the first step. You get into neutral first, and then from there you can build on. But if you are able to cultivate more positive emotion, that's better, much better. And the positive emotions include like compassion, right? And patience, right? Patience is very much necessary these days because we have lots of things in our hands that we are not able to accomplish that resulted in stress and all these things. So patience, without patience, you cannot do anything. So there, these sort of mental emotions, if you are able to enhance or if you are able to cultivate, then it's better if you cultivate more positive emotions. Thank you.
I just have, yeah, I just have this question for Dr. Shefali. Ma'am, in your experience, I was curious to know when there is this collapse of self, vis-a-vis your patient, then what is the role of transference and counter-transference in the reconstruction of the self? Thank you.
So that's what I was actually explained it at one point of time, that it almost felt that in my own counter transference, that my mind was actually collapsing. I felt very exhausted. And it was much later in the session when she pointed out that, I'm breaking down in front of you, I'm making an emotional communication, but your mind is exhausted. How will you see it? How will you witness it? Because at that point of time, actually, I also realized that through that counter transference, I realized that she was saying that I had to become that mind. I cannot collapse. Because if I collapse, then both of us are collapsing. Then there is no mind to witness. So I had to become that mind to witness while she was collapsing. And then it will not become very anxiety provoking for her. Because now she knew that Sabindi can make sense of it for her. Yeah. Then she survived. That's why the session changed after that. Then she could play around with it. Then she could also say to me that, oh, I want to create a music of this. That my being can also exist in the form of music. It won't feel so broken then. Yeah, because I can experience music, but I can't experience single notes of things. So that's how we also experience a person as a whole. And that had to emerge through that countertransference also. So in that sense, it helped. It really helped for me to make sense what she wanted me to become for her in that caretaking role.
Thank you so much. And we'll have a round of applause for the panelists. And
So we have now come to the end of third session, and I would like to thank Ms. Gauri Gilla, our chairperson, for chairing this session, and to all the participants for sharing us on how to treat the emotional imbalance supported by yoga, mindfulness, and the concept of mind training in Buddhism. So now I would like to request Mrs. Renuka Singh, professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, to kindly offer the souvenirs and khatak to the speakers. Thank you. Miss Gauri Gill. Venerable Geshe-Ngao Nobula. And last, Miss Shifali Singh.